everyone, welcome to the Norman Rockwell Museum at Stockbridge. My name is Stephanie Plunkett and I'm the manager of adult services here at the museum. And I'm going to be talking with you this morning about an exhibition that I've had the opportunity to curate this year, which is called The Art of Enchantment. It's been on view here at the museum since September 1995 through March 1996 and focuses on classic works illustrated by 12 contemporary illustrators. The illustrations in the exhibition are based on classic stories for children. And we began our thinking process about a year ago in remembering that Norman Rockwell began drawing as a young boy by listening to classic stories told to him by his father, such as those by Charles Dickens. He would ask his father over and over again to read aloud the descriptions of the characters that Dickens had imagined and tried to draw them until he felt that his images were in keeping with the words of the author. The illustrators here have done a beautiful job of finding images which describe perfectly and add to the words of the authors who have described these tales. The first work that I'm going to show you this morning is that of the illustrator Kinuko. She's a wonderful artist who came originally from her native Japan and studied art here in the United States. She's at the top of her field in editorial and advertising illustrations. However, she was kind of cajoled into going into the children's book market by her friend and author Mariana Mayer, who wrote this tale, or I should say adapted this tale, called The 12 Dancing Princesses. Once Kinuko realized the creative potential in children's books, she became truly enamored of them. One of the wonderful opportunities that artists have in a book is to illustrate the passage of time in a way that they would never be able to in one single image. They also have the opportunity to develop characters and scenes very much in keeping with those in their own imagination. Kinuko illustrated the 12 Dancing Princesses in a very classical manner. Her paintings are traditional oil paintings on paper done in a glaze technique. She's even incorporated gold leaf into the borders, which are drawn from historical contexts. One of the things that she pays great attention to is the way that words and images appear together on the printed page. She has designed complete images as well as insets, which are smaller images that are meant to highlight specific aspects of the book and specific scenes. Instead of focusing on specific characters and character development, Kinuko has chosen in this book to give a true sense of mood and atmosphere, a sense of magic about the story. If you notice, in some cases, as in the scene of the enchanted forest, the figures are seen in a very kind of dreamlike, atmospheric manner. And this is really to give the sense of the enchanted quality of the story. The next piece that I'd like to show you is also an adaptation of the 12 Dancing Princesses, done by another artist who lives quite near to us in Ware, Massachusetts, and her name is Ruth Sanderson. It's wonderful to see how two artists can take the same work and similar text and transform it and adapt it in a very different way. Ruth Sanderson both wrote and illustrated this adaptation of the 12 Dancing Princesses. She took her inspiration from stories written by both the brothers Grimm and Andrew Lang, and decided to set her tale in 15th century England, which is a period that she admires for its grace and charm. She did a great deal of research into the costume of the period, which she depicted very, very carefully, and actually had a costumer design from her sketches the dresses that you see in the illustrations here. She drew from local models very much like Norman Rockwell did, and found 5 women who posed as the 12 princesses in her story, and by changing hairstyles and clothing, created 12 from the 5. Her stress in the story was to create a sense of the personalities of the individuals in the tale, particularly the youngest sister, who she calls Lena. She was a little bit concerned about doing the story at first because she realized that in many of the scenes there would have to be many figures painted, something that is not easy and is extremely time-consuming for an illustrator. But you see here that she varies scenes which are more monumental with just a couple of characters to scenes which contain all of the sisters as well as a prince and a king here and there. She's remained extremely faithful to the architecture of the period and draws from many sources for her reference, including books and photographs that she herself takes in her travels. She's wonderful at using techniques to give a sense of the visual texture of things. For example, the texture of marble as compared to the drapery of rich fabric and the feel of hair and skin. Ruth Sanderson actually came to teach a class here recently and was a great source of inspiration for students who are interested in classical painting techniques. The tale of Cinderella was first written down by the French author Charles Perrault in 1697 and has since become one of our favorite and most remembered classic tales. This Cinderella has been illustrated by Susan Jeffers, who since the beginning of her career has focused on fairy tales for children because she feels that in tales, children themselves are often the heroes and heroines of the story. Also in fairy tales, native cunning has the opportunity to win out over refined sentiment. Her drawing style is very delicate, as you can see here, in that she uses very fine hatched lines drawn in pen and ink to create the form of her figures, and goes back later in very thin tinted inks to give a very faint but beautiful sense of color. In her work, the white surface of the paper is allowed to come through, creating a sense of light in the drawings. She also tries to find interesting perspectives for us to experience her tales. For example, in this illustration of Cinderella in the coach, she blocks our view, asking us to look through a pattern of hundreds of blossoms in order to find the action. Susan Jeffers finds great inspiration in having her stories actually acted out by friends and family before she begins her illustrations. She finds that in their excitement and animation, she always sees something new and finds a new way to experience the story. This particular image was the cover of the book. She's created a very strong, monumental view of Cinderella here. And in fact, we used it here at the museum on the cover of our catalog as well. A cover illustration, it said, has about 3 to 5 seconds to impact on the viewer and to entice the viewer to pick up the book and look through its pages. So it has to be quite powerful. And this is a very beautiful drawing, as you can see. The illustrations that we see here were done by Gary Kelley, who has received accolades for his pastel drawings from all areas of the illustration field. The book that's represented on our walls is Rip Van Winkle, which was first published by Washington Irving in 1820. In order to do research for the book, Gary Kelley, who lives in Iowa, came east to the Hudson River Valley, particularly around Tarrytown, which is where Washington Irving lived, to study the landscape, to really try to make the book look and feel authentic. He also researched into the work of American artists who were working at about the same period realists such as John Singleton Copley, as well as the Hudson River School painters such as Frederick Edwin Church and Thomas Cole. He tried to adapt his drawing style to reflect the feeling of the work that was being done at the time. He uses pastel as his medium of choice because he feels that with pastel he can attain the richness of oil paint in much less time. He layers one color on top of the other until he feels that he's attained his desired effect. Unusual in children's books is his use of deep, dark, rich colors, as in this image here of the flying hourglass over the Hudson River landscape. What we've tried to do in the exhibition is to use labels which refer to the text in order to draw a comparison between image and the written word. For example, this image, which includes Rip Van Winkle in the landscape, goes along with the text which says, "The torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin. Here then, poor Rip was brought to a stand," which is what we see here. Illustrations often define and extend the written word. Jerry Pinkney is an illustrator who has been illustrating children's books for over 30 years. He has the rare distinction of winning 3 Caldecott medals, 3 Coretta Scott King Awards, and the Hamilton King Award, awarded by the Society of Illustrators in 1993 for the best illustration of the year. The book that he has illustrated here is called The Last Tales of Uncle Remus, the last in a series of Uncle Remus books which have been produced by Dial Books for Young Readers, which stem from the largest collection of African American folk tales that we have, recorded on the slave plantations of the South by Joel Chandler Harris. Jerry Pinkney paints in watercolor by layering pencil and paint one on top of the other to create a wonderful luminous effect. His pencil line has tremendous variation, and he enjoys drawing above all other forms of art. In order to create the unique sense of animation that the animals in this series have, he costumed himself in the clothing that animals such as Brer Rabbit and his cohorts would have worn, and took on the poses of those animals in order to create them in a very realistic way, in a very believable way. Illustrated here on our walls are a series of pictures from several different stories in the book, including Why the Cricket Has Elbows on His Legs, Impty Umpty and the Blacksmith, where we see Brer Rabbit peeking out ever so slightly here in the corner of the illustration. As in this illustration of Brer Rabbit and Miss Nancy, in folk tales, humans and animals often interact as though it's perfectly normal. An author and an illustrator can get away with saying a lot more about real-life situations through the use of animals than they can through the use of human interaction. The images that we see here are by illustrator Fred Marcellino, who became well known as an artist before doing children's books as the illustrator of book covers. He's illustrated such covers as Bonfire of the Vanities and August, which were both bestsellers. But he turned to children's book illustration because he loved the idea of creating a series of images to depict one tale. In The Steadfast Tin Soldier, which we see here, first written down by Hans Christian Andersen, Mr. Marcellino actually traveled to Denmark, where the story is set, and did research on traditional Danish costume and architecture before putting his images together. He's attracted to the cinematic qualities of book illustration, the idea that he, as the artist, can give the viewer a feeling of what it's like to look down on an image, as in the image of the sinking soldier, and also to look up on the image, as in the image of the maid cutting the fish open and finding the steadfast tin soldier inside. He works in colored pencil on colored papers in order to achieve the effects that he does For example, this image of the housetops in the snow is done on a deep blue paper in order to achieve the nighttime effects. The images that we see here are by artist Stephen T. Johnson, who's done these illustrations for Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, first published in 1843. A Christmas Carol has been told and retold many times, both in print and in film, and provided a challenge for Mr. Johnson to try to find his own personal way to tell and see the story. Trained as an artist in his home state of Kansas, as well as abroad in Europe for several years, Mr. Johnson studied classical drawing and draws on his strengths as a draftsman to create this work. To find models to portray Scrooge and other characters in the book, Mr. Johnson looked to local models, just as Norman Rockwell did, to find people who he felt suited the characters that he wished to portray. For example, his father here portrays the ghost of Christmas Present and sat for Steve many times. Stephen Johnson tried to give the sense of Scrooge's inner emotions in his drawing and tried to create a Scrooge that was both human and interesting. In attention to detail, he even sewed the stocking cap and the nightshirt that Scrooge wears in these illustrations. In order to create these pieces, the vibrant color is layered on in both pastel and gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. Pencil is also used for shading and dramatic effect. Illustrator Paul Zelinsky first thought that he would be a fine arts painter, but after taking a course at Yale University with the illustrator Maurice Sendak, he realized that children's books were something that he wanted to pursue. Here we see wonderful illustrations from the book Rumpelstiltskin, which is a favorite fairy tale for many. In order to create the pictures, Paul Zelinsky did a great deal of research into the history of the story and found that there were 4 basic interpretations early on by the Brothers Grimm, first published in 1815, then again in 1819. The book was called Children's and Household Tales, first printed in German and later in 1824 in English for English-speaking children. Mr. Zelinsky chose to focus on the 1819 version, which today is the most popular version of the story. An illustrator of great versatility, Paul Zelinsky changes his style to suit the text of the books that he works on, because he feels that he wants a real connection to be felt between words and images. In these images, Paul Zelinsky creates the feeling of early traditional oil paintings by paying great attention to detail, using fine drawing techniques, shallow space in his illustrations. He even uses the turning head and specific gazes of some of the characters to indicate that the page will turn. For example, in the image where Rumpelstiltskin demands the young princess's first child, the character looks to her left, indicating that the page will turn. In some cases, artists will create a much more interior space, capturing the viewer within the space of the painting by having characters look in instead of out. Chris Van Allsburg is an artist who's challenged our notions about what picture books can and should be. He began as a successful sculptor and soon realized that the narrative qualities inherent in his work could be transformed in picture books. He begins his work by starting sketching just one image. The stories for him don't come before the pictures, which is quite unusual. From one single image, a story usually evolves. He writes his own manuscripts and creates all of the pictures that go with the story. Swan Lake, which is represented here, is the first book in which Mr. Van Allsburg has illustrated the words of another author. The book was written by Mark Halperin based upon the music by Peter Tchaikovsky. Mr. van Allsburg has given his images the look and feel and grandeur of St. Petersburg in Russia, where Tchaikovsky was born. He drew for inspiration on the work of Russian folk artists, whose vibrant color, decorative patterns, and strong line inspired him. He always helps us to see something a little bit unexpected. And here, for example, in the image of the older man reading a book, he uses his dogs as pillows, as we might use cushions on a carpeted rug. Barry Moser is an illustrator who's local to us. He lives in North Hatfield, Massachusetts. He sees himself as not just an illustrator, but a total book maker. He's someone who, in his books, designs all of the type, illustrations, placement, chooses the paper and the end papers, completing a project that is a complete work of art and is meant to be seen together instead of illustrations by themselves. He's the owner of the Pennyroyal Press, which produces fine illustrated books, including Alice in Wonderland, as well as many others. In these particular illustrations for Beauty and the Beast, Barry created the images by doing woodcuts, which are a very traditional form of creating images, particularly for illustrators. The image is designed, then drawn and carved into hard wood, formerly boxwood, but now, in many cases, hard maple. He chooses, for the most part, monumental images, single images of homes or figures, which appear very striking in black and white. In his research, Barry looked at past models of Beauty and the Beast and looked at many different adaptations, both in print and on film, including the original story by Madame Beaumont from 1757. He also worked with author Nancy Willard to come up with just the right setting for the book. They went to upstate New York and found one of the oldest homes in the state called Wilderstein. Together they walked the floors and looked at the rooms until they could imagine the characters in the setting. It's very rare for an illustrator to work closely with an author in collaboration, but this is something that Barry Moser likes to do. In fact, sometimes authors and illustrators never meet or even have the opportunity to talk. Barry Moser is somebody who himself writes many of his books and uses himself as a model on many occasions, as in this example of the beast in the book. He's wonderful at giving us just a glimpse of a scene to pique our imagination. For example, when we see the protagonist's shoe and dress at the bottom of the staircase, giving us just enough information to know what's happening. The illustrations that we see here are by artist Alain Vaës, whose career has taken many turns. First a professional soccer player in his native France for about 10 years, Mr. Vaës studied art, then became a set designer for some of the most prominent ballet companies in the world, including the Boston Ballet, the New York City Ballet, and the Fort Worth Ballet Company, among others. His love for theatrics and for fancy and for fairy tales brought him to the illustration of children's books. The book that is represented here is Reynard the Fox. By the 15th century, the fox had become a well-known protagonist in tales where animal characters took on human roles, in many cases took on court roles, approximating loosely the court figures of the day. Reynard is seen in many different situations where he inspires trouble, but at the end of the book, he certainly gets his comeuppance. These images are beautifully drawn and executed in luminous watercolor, which show Mr. Vaës' love of craftsmanship and of the old masters in his detail of clothing and setting and beauty of technique. It also shows his love of whimsy and of the comical aspects of human nature. An artist of international acclaim, Gennady Spirin was born in Russia in a small town outside Moscow and now lives in the United States. At a very early age, he was identified as a child who was very talented, and so at the age of 11, he left home to study at the famous Surikov Secondary School of Art. There he learned classical drawing and painting technique and studied for many years to perfect his style. He realized early on that fantasy was what he was interested in, and so children's books seemed a natural step for him to take, first producing books abroad and then in the United States of America, where he has won many awards from the Society of Illustrators. The tale that he's chosen to illustrate here is the Brothers Grimm Snow White and Rose Red, which was first set down in their initial book of tales in 1812 and then again in 1815. The tale is one that he loved as a boy, and it's also set in a part of Northern Europe that he knows very well. His style is to create intricate and beautiful borders in many cases. Here he shows us an arched window, which he invites us to look at the scene through. His fine drawing is paired with beautiful watercolor technique, in which much detail is created by the use of a very fine brush. In some cases, he gives us just a glimpse of a piece of the story in a small portion of the picture, with the rest left blank, balancing the negative space with the positive image, creating a beautiful balance. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the art of enchantment here at the Norman Rockwell Museum. We've enjoyed having the exhibition here, and it reminds us that picture books provide people of all ages with dynamic, moving, exciting experiences with literature, which hopefully provide children with a love of reading that lasts for a lifetime.